Jill Biden thought she could quietly humiliate Michelle Obama with a cruel whisper, calling her Barack's puppet, right in front of America's most powerful people. But in just 7 electrifying seconds, Michelle, poised, unshaken, delivered one explosive sentence that didn't just defend her honor. It ripped open 20 years of hidden truths about race, corruption, and betrayal in the halls of power. Gasps filled the room. Cameras zoomed in. Jill's confident smile vanished as she stood frozen, exposed, and speechless. And now the nation can't stop asking, what secrets were so dangerous that people risked forging signatures and silencing witnesses just to keep Michelle Obama quiet? The Unity for America. Women's Summit was the kind of event Washington insiders whispered about for weeks. A gathering drenched in prestige, with crystal chandeliers glittering above tables, set for power breakfasts and delicate negotiations. The ballroom was a swirl of bright scarves, expensive perfumes, and the low thrum of journalists, already half-caffeinated and tapping frantically at their phones, trying to predict who might deliver the next headline. Reporters barked complicated coffee orders to frazzled interns, half-sweet, extra dry, oat milk, no foam, and bickered over which First Lady would be wearing what color, as though the fate of the nation hung on the shade of someone's pantsuit. Across the room, senators' wives clustered together, subtly sizing up each other's hairdos, the way soldiers might compare armor before battle, murmuring about silk suppliers, gala invitations, and whose husband was quietly being investigated for something no one would dare name out loud. The air buzzed with forced laughter and polite hypocrisy, that particular brand of Washington unity that always managed to look inspiring in photos while hiding knives behind every smile. And amid all this, Michelle Obama stood at the far end of the room, poised, elegant in a white suit that seemed to catch the light just so, her hair styled in perfect, soft waves. At 61, she carried herself with a lawyer's precision and a woman's intuition honed by years of surviving politics' sharpest edges. She watched the scene unfold with a trace of bemused detachment, amused by how these people chanted words like togetherness while plotting each other's downfalls between sips of artisanal coffee. She noticed a congresswoman laughing a little too hard at a rival's joke, and an aide slipping a folded paper into someone's handbag like passing contraband. Michelle often thought politics was like a high school cafeteria, except with more money, worse secrets, and an even deadlier social hierarchy. And so, for the moment, she played her part perfectly, smiling warmly, shaking hands, and pretending not to notice the way certain eyes followed her every step, waiting for her to slip. But tension hung in the air like static electricity, invisible yet undeniable, growing sharper as the event's official program finally announced the special moment everyone anticipated, the photo opportunity featuring 2 of America's most high-profile First Ladies, Michelle Obama and Jill Biden. Murmurs rippled across the hall as camera crews jockeyed for angles. Reporters unscrewed their pen caps with dramatic flair, and political wives subtly elbowed each other closer for a better view. The moderator's voice floated above the room, bright and rehearsed, as she called both women to the stage. The moment felt choreographed, a bit like theater, yet no one could shake the sense that something unscripted was waiting just beneath the surface, like a tremor before an earthquake. Michelle stepped forward, pulse steady, gliding into place next to Jill, who wore a tailored suit in democratic blue, her signature blonde hair teased higher than usual, as if she hoped it might brush the chandeliers and remind the crowd who was in the White House now. Cameras flashed, a sea of lenses swallowing them both in white light. Jill leaned slightly closer, chin lifted, and for a single heartbeat, the 2 women seemed locked in the kind of poised stillness politicians train for, the false calm that precedes either a handshake or a dagger. Then, without warning, Jill's voice slipped out in a whisper, sharp as a paper cut, slicing the moment in half as she hissed, "Still Barack's puppet, I see." For a breathless instant, time seemed to stutter. Michelle's eyes widened, though just barely, a flash of vulnerability flickering across her face before her jaw set, her posture steel rod straight. She could have stepped back. She could have pretended not to hear. But decades of measured silence roared in her chest, demanding release, and in that instant, Michelle Obama made a split-second decision that would change everything. The ballroom, alive with chatter only seconds before, fell into an eerie hush, as if every person had simultaneously decided to hold their breath. Microphones hung suspended in midair. Cameras tilted forward, hungry for what would come next. Even the rustle of silk dresses seemed to freeze, leaving a silence so thick it pressed against ribs and made hearts pound in ears. All eyes fixed on Michelle, the world teetering on the edge of a moment destined to fracture history into before and after. Michelle stood there, the sharp sting of Jill's words still lingering in the space between them, like smoke after a gunshot. For the briefest instant, she almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. The glittering chandeliers overhead, the velvet ropes corralling reporters, the icy smiles of women who'd spent thousands of dollars to look effortlessly elegant while plotting one another's political demise. She thought, rather dryly, that if Washington's power brokers lied any smoother, they'd sell butter without even bothering to churn it. And despite the way her heart thumped against her ribs, a cool and cutting humor surfaced in her mind, because sometimes humor was the only weapon left. "I'd rather be a puppet than a prop in someone else's puppet show," she thought, picturing the swirl of consultants, strategists, and hangers-on who tried to script every word a public figure spoke. It was almost comical, the lengths to which these people went to control the narrative, crafting photo ops and sound bites, then whispering insults in private, as though the truth could stay hidden forever under layers of spin. As cameras continued to flash, Michelle shifted slightly, tilting her chin as if to survey the crowd, taking in the gleaming lenses, the bright lights, the greedy curiosity etched into every face. She noticed a reporter, leaning so far forward he was nearly falling off his folding chair, eyes wide behind thick glasses, ready to devour whatever words might tumble from her lips. There was something wickedly funny about how everyone here pretended to care about unity while secretly praying for a scandal that could dominate tomorrow's front page. And in that fragile, teetering silence, Michelle realized she was suddenly holding the room in the palm of her hand, every soul waiting to see whether she would swallow her pride or strike back. For a woman who'd endured years of scrutiny, insults, and whispers about everything from her race to her marriage, this moment felt like the point where an entire lifetime of biting her tongue came to an end. So she turned her eyes squarely on Jill Biden, her voice soft, yet carrying like a velvet blade, and said, "At least I never forged my husband's signature to steal from Americans." The sentence dropped into the hush like a boulder into still water, sending ripples crashing through the room. Audible gasps broke out as if the entire crowd had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe. The moderator's lips parted in shock, a hand flying to her chest, while several journalists fumbled their phones, thumbs shaking as they tried to tweet before their competitors. Close-ups captured Jill's eyes, which blinked rapidly as her forced smile evaporated, leaving behind only stark, pale disbelief. A senator's wife clutched the pearls around her neck so hard they nearly snapped. Somewhere towards the back, a young intern whispered, "Oh my God," as though she'd witnessed the ground splitting open beneath her feet. It was as though Michelle had detonated a hidden fault line that no one had dared acknowledge, and now truth was rumbling out like an earthquake, unstoppable and fierce. Within seconds, hashtags like #Michelle Strikes Back, number sign First Lady Showdown, and number sign Truth Over Politics were flashing across phones all over the ballroom, spreading like wildfire through social media. Reporters barked orders at cameramen, demanding close-ups and reaction shots, their eyes wide with the realization that they were witnessing history unfold in real time. And in that chaos, amid the swirl of stunned gasps and camera lights, Michelle remained perfectly still, her shoulders straight, her gaze locked on Jill, knowing she just crossed a line that would forever divide her life and the country itself into everything before this moment and everything after. No sooner had Michelle's words left her lips than the ballroom erupted into a low buzz that spread like a contagion. 1,000 hushed conversations blooming all at once, as though no one wanted to be caught speaking too loudly, and yet no one could resist leaning closer to gossip. Reporters pressed their faces together, trying to keep their voices discreet, as one wide-eyed journalist whispered, "Is this real, or is Michelle auditioning for Scandal?" The reference drew nervous laughter from a few others, who glanced around as if half expecting Olivia Pope herself to emerge from the velvet curtains, white trench coat billowing, ready to fix the crisis. Meanwhile, senators seated near the front row sat rigid in their chairs, blinking rapidly, each one already panic texting staffers under the table, thumbs flying across screens to demand urgent briefings or, perhaps, plausible deniability. Some aides read the texts and nearly dropped their phones, faces draining of color as they realized that this wasn't simply political theater, it was the real thing, and they were all trapped on stage without a script. The room vibrated with a curious mix of exhilaration and fear, like a circus where someone had released a lion into the ring and no one was quite sure who would get eaten first. Michelle remained at the podium, appearing almost serene, as though daring anyone to interrupt her. The flicker of humor that had danced in her eyes moments before was gone now, replaced by a cold, focused fire that left no doubt she was done playing the polite First Lady. She adjusted the microphone with a calm precision, glanced briefly at Jill, who was trying very hard to keep her smile glued in place, and began to speak in a tone so measured and authoritative that people leaned forward involuntarily, desperate to catch every word. "I stayed silent for years out of respect," Michelle said, her voice echoing through the hush. "But respect cannot become complicity." She reached into the clutch she'd been holding and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, the crisp rustle loud in the otherwise breathless room. While President Biden was struggling with his health, there were people around him who used his name to authorize contracts he never approved. She continued, unfolding the document with delicate care, like revealing a sacred text. They used what's called an auto pen, an automatic machine that duplicates a person's signature, to forge his name on documents worth millions of taxpayer dollars. She paused, letting the words sink in, watching as an entire row of journalists blinked at her in stunned silence, pens frozen in midair. Michelle lifted the paper slightly higher so the camera flashes reflected off its surface. "This contract alone," she said, tapping the page with a manicured finger, "sent $900,000 overseas for services that were never delivered. It was signed without Joe Biden's knowledge." A murmur rolled through the audience, swelling into a wave of sharp inhalations and disbelieving gasps. Jill, who had been trying to maintain composure, now looked as though she'd just stepped off a spinning carousel, her skin draining of color until her face was almost as pale as the ivory fabric of Michelle's suit. The moderator's jaw had gone slack, her eyes darting frantically between the two women as if silently begging someone, anyone, to intervene and return the event to its planned, nonpartisan schedule. But there would be no going back. In the space of a few sentences, Michelle had transformed a polite women's summit into the epicenter of a national scandal, laying bare secrets that had apparently lived in plain sight, invisible only because no one had dared to speak them aloud. And as whispers swept the ballroom like wind through dry grass, the weight of the revelation pressed down on every person in the room, each of them knowing they were witnessing not just a political spectacle, but a reckoning that could shake Washington to its very core. As soon as Michelle finished speaking and the ballroom plunged into stunned silence, the rest of the country began to roar to life in a frenzy of pixels and hashtags. Twitter practically caught fire, timelines scrolling faster than the eye could follow as users from every corner of America threw in their takes, memes, and hot takes. One tweet, retweeted thousands of times within minutes, blared in bold capital letters, "Michelle dropped more tea than the Boston Harbor." Another read, "Jill tried it, but Michelle came armed with receipts and a law degree." While gifs of people dramatically fainting or clutching invisible pearls flooded the feed. Over on TikTok, young creators were already staging comedic reenactments of the scene, complete with cardboard microphones, flashy stage lighting, and captions like, "Breaking, the puppet fights back." In one viral video, a woman dressed as Michelle stood poised while a friend, wearing a hastily assembled blonde wig for Jill, hissed the insult, "Still Barack's puppet," only for Michelle to whip around and drop the bombshell line, prompting canned gasps and dramatic music that would have fit a movie trailer. Even late-night comedians couldn't resist, splicing footage of Michelle's retort into their opening monologues, delivering punchlines about how Jill's whispered insult had triggered the clapback heard round the world. The entire internet seemed locked in a collective scream-laugh cycle, unable to look away from the spectacle unfolding in real time. But humor, as always, only partially masked the deeper shock rippling through the country. Underneath the memes and comedic skits, real pain and outrage began bubbling to the surface as people connected Michelle's revelations to their own lived experiences. News outlets scrambled to gather reactions from ordinary Americans, whose voices cracked with emotion as they shared stories that suddenly made far too much sense. A video interview surfaced featuring an elderly black woman with soft eyes, her hands trembling as she clutched a faded photograph of her husband in uniform. Tears welled in her eyes as she spoke into the microphone, her voice quivering. "My husband died waiting for surgery they said they couldn't fund," she whispered. "Now I know why. They took the money and signed it away with a machine while my husband was fighting for his life." In living rooms and kitchens across the nation, viewers sat frozen, breath caught in their throats, as these quiet, devastating truths spilled out onto their screens. In the summit ballroom itself, the mood had shifted from stunned silence to open weeping in some corners, as guests, once there for polite speeches and networking, realized they were now witnesses to a deeper reckoning. The tension thickened into something almost tangible, an electric charge that seemed to hum between the chandeliers and polished marble floors. The nation's laughter faded into an uneasy hush as people began to grapple with the raw human cost hidden behind forged signatures and secret contracts. And amid the viral noise and flashing headlines, a single question lingered in countless minds. How much truth had been buried all these years, and how many lives had been quietly sacrificed to keep those secrets locked away? Behind the velvet curtains of the summit stage, as the crowd outside buzzed with whispers and camera flashes, Jill Biden was a woman coming apart at the seams. The instant the door to the green room clicked shut behind her, her polished composure shattered like glass dropped on marble. With a furious swing, she slammed her palm onto the polished conference table so hard that several water bottles toppled over and rolled onto the floor, one bursting open and splattering droplets onto a silk rug worth more than some Americans' annual salaries. Papers scattered in a white flurry as Jill's voice rose into a shrill, furious pitch. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she shouted, eyes blazing as she turned on her stunned staff. "She was supposed to stay silent." One aide, a young woman with trembling hands, tried to gather up the papers only to flinch when Jill's voice cracked like a whip again. "How did she get those documents? Who let this happen? I want names. Jill ranted, pacing the room in tight circles like a lion trapped in a cage, her heels clicking furiously against the floor. Another staffer mumbled something about damage control, but Jill spun around, hair disheveled, face flushed, and barked, "There's no controlling this. She's blown the whole damn thing open." Yet the rage, while volcanic, couldn't mask the tremor of fear hiding in Jill's voice. Her eyes darted wildly, as if she were searching for a way to rewind time, to erase the moment Michelle had spoken those damning words. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, none of them daring to mention the social media storm raging outside the closed doors, where number Michelle strikes back was trending worldwide, and news outlets were already calling this the biggest political bombshell of the decade. Jill slammed her hand down one last time before sinking into a chair, chest heaving, as the room fell silent except for the soft buzz of muted televisions broadcasting the chaos unfolding live outside. Later that night, after the crowds had dispersed and the cameras were packed away, Jill sat alone in her hotel suite, the only sound the faint hiss of the air conditioner cycling on and off. Her rage had burned itself out, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the creeping chill of regret. With trembling fingers, she pulled out a sheet of hotel stationery and began to write. Her pen hovered over the page as tears gathered in her eyes, her mask of certainty slipping away completely. In a scrawl that was at once careful and raw, she wrote, "You were right. I didn't protect Joe. I let resentment speak." She paused, the words looking stark and naked against the paper before adding, "I mocked you because I was afraid. I pretended everything was fine when it wasn't. Maybe I became what I used to hate, and maybe you became what I once couldn't understand. Brave." She folded the note slowly, pressing the crease with shaking hands, then placed it in an envelope addressed simply to Michelle Obama. For the first time in hours, Jill allowed herself to sob, muffling the sound against her trembling fingers as she whispered to the empty room, "What have I done?" While chaos churned in newsrooms and social media feeds, Michelle moved quietly through the backstage corridors of the Summit Hall, her heels clicking softly on marble tiles as she kept her face composed and her voice low. People clustered in hushed groups wherever she passed, eyes following her as if she carried not just scandal, but some unspoken hope that honesty might finally win out over spin. Amid the swirl of shocked aides and frantic phone calls, Michelle found a young intern huddled in a corner, shoulders trembling as she tried, and failed, to keep tears from spilling down her cheeks. Michelle paused, gently touched the girl's arm, and crouched down so they were eye to eye. "Hey," Michelle said softly, her voice warm despite the storm raging outside. "Politics is ugly, but people are beautiful." The intern tried to apologize, stammering about how she wasn't supposed to cry at work, but Michelle smiled, smoothing a stray curl back from the young woman's forehead. "If you're crying," she said, "it means you care. That's never a weakness." For a fleeting moment, the intern managed a shaky laugh, wiping her eyes as Michelle stood and gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. But the tenderness of that moment was quickly swallowed by the gravity of what came next. As Michelle made her way back toward the main corridor, a voice called her name, sharp, yet trembling. Turning, Michelle saw Natalie Brooks, a mid-level staffer who had kept a low profile during most administrations. A woman whose wide eyes and quivering lips betrayed that she carried a burden far too heavy for one person alone. Natalie clutched a slim flash drive so tightly, her knuckles blanched white, her breath coming in ragged bursts, as though she'd just sprinted a marathon. "Mrs. Obama," Natalie said, her voice cracking, as tears slipped down her cheeks. "I have to tell you the truth. I forged those papers because they told me to. Jill knew. They all knew." The words hung between them like a razor's edge, slicing through the remnants of any pretense that this was merely a political feud. Michelle reached out, steady and calm, placing her hand over Natalie's trembling fingers. In that touch was not just comfort, but the silent promise that the tide of silence was turning, and that even the smallest voices would no longer have to carry secrets alone. For the first time since the summit began, Michelle felt not rage or fear, but the determined certainty that what had begun as a whispered insult had now ignited something far bigger. A reckoning that could not be silenced, no matter how many signatures were forged or secrets buried. And as Natalie wept quietly beside her, Michelle knew that the true battle was only just beginning. Under the wan glow of flickering candles, a gentle breeze rustled the American flags gathered around the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, where hundreds of people stood shoulder to shoulder in a vigil that was equal parts protest, prayer, and quiet rebellion. The crowd was a sea of diverse faces, young activists gripping handmade signs, elderly couples holding each other for warmth, and veterans in faded uniforms decorated with service ribbons that caught the candlelight like small, flickering stars. The atmosphere, though somber, occasionally rippled with unexpected humor that felt like a shared coping mechanism, laughter bubbling up between tears as people clung to moments of human connection amid the chaos. An elderly veteran with a weathered face and eyes that sparkled despite the lines of age leaned heavily on his cane and, with a wry grin, rasped out, "I'd stand up for Michelle, but these knees ain't what they used to be." A few people nearby burst into soft laughter, wiping their eyes, grateful for the small relief of a joke that cut through the heavy silence like a shaft of sunlight through storm clouds. Another man added, "Amen, brother. My knees just filed for disability benefits after hearing all this drama." It was laughter laced with fatigue, the sound of a nation exhausted from years of secrets, scandals, and silent suffering. But the laughter could only hold back the tide of emotion for so long. As the candles flickered and the low hum of conversations faded, Michelle stepped forward to the microphone set at the top of the steps, her silhouette framed by the towering marble columns behind her. The murmurs fell into silence as she looked out over the crowd, her face illuminated by soft pools of candlelight. Her voice, when it came, was soft, yet carried with the weight of a gavel striking wood. "I didn't want revenge," Michelle said, pausing as her gaze swept across tearful eyes and trembling shoulders. "I wanted the truth to matter again." The words hung suspended in the night air, sharper than the chill breeze sweeping off the reflecting pool. For a moment, the world seemed to stop, as though even the distant traffic had gone silent to listen. Michelle inhaled slowly, voice trembling just enough to betray the ache beneath her poise. "For too long, we've been taught that silence equals dignity, that speaking up makes us angry or ungrateful or divisive," she continued. "But silence also protects the powerful, and I can't be silent anymore." As she spoke, sobs rose softly from pockets of the crowd. A young woman held a photo of a veteran who died waiting for medical treatment, her shoulders shaking as she wept. Michelle's words washed over the crowd like a tide, stirring grief, fury, and, for the first time in a long time, the glimmer of hope that maybe the truth could finally have its day. And there, under the silent watch of Abraham Lincoln's statue, a vigil that had begun as a gathering for healing, transformed into the opening act of something far bigger, a movement that could no longer be contained. While thousands stood in candlelight outside, the marble corridors of Capitol Hill echoed with frantic footsteps, murmured debates, and the shuffle of hastily printed memos being passed from hand to hand. Inside the chamber, Congress was in a state of comedic disarray, as though every senator and representative had suddenly found themselves starring in a political farce they hadn't rehearsed for. One congressman, a portly man whose tie perpetually hung slightly askew, leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "So, Do we clap for Michelle or investigate her? His friend gave a helpless shrug, eyes darting around nervously as though the correct answer might be printed somewhere on the chamber walls. Meanwhile, aides whispered heatedly behind pillars, trading rumors and theories about who might have leaked the documents, which news outlet was dropping the next bombshell, and whether Jill Biden was going to resign, apologize, or both. A few of the more performative senators tried to look solemn for the cameras, practicing lines that balanced outrage with cautious neutrality. One junior senator was overheard muttering, "We've got to be careful. This could be a civil rights hero moment or a total PR nightmare." Another chimed in, "Maybe we should just give her an award and hope she stops talking." It was clear that the entire political establishment was struggling to figure out how to navigate a truth that refused to fit into tidy partisan boxes. The hallways buzzed with contradictions, jokes laced with real fear, and a growing realization that the old ways of burying scandal under red tape might not work this time. And yet, amid the comic chaos, a voice finally rose above the noise, a measured, trembling voice that demanded attention. Congresswoman Carla Moore, a moderate Democrat known for her fiery honesty and carefully measured words, stepped to the podium in a press room packed to bursting with cameras and anxious reporters. Her hands shook slightly as she gripped the edges of the lectern, eyes blazing beneath her furrowed brow. "If these allegations are true," Carla said, her voice cracking with emotion, "they shame every public servant who ever swore an oath to serve the American people." She paused, swallowing hard, and when she continued, her words were sharper, each syllable falling like a hammer. "We cannot allow loyalty to power to outweigh loyalty to the truth. Not anymore. I am calling for a full, bipartisan investigation into these contracts, the forged signatures, and the networks behind them. Because if we fail to act now, then every American who ever believed in justice has been betrayed." Gasps swept through the press room as cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion on Carla's face. The crowd outside the Capitol began to cheer, voices echoing off the stone walls, while inside, seasoned politicians stared at each other with pale faces, realizing that the reckoning Michelle had ignited was not slowing down. It was charging forward like a tide they could no longer hold back. And in the stunned silence that followed, it became clear to everyone watching that this was no longer just Michelle's fight. It was a fight for the soul of the country. The days following the vigil were a blur of interviews, congressional hearings, and headlines screaming in bold fonts across every screen. Yet, amid the roar of politics and scandal, Michelle found herself holding on to the smallest moments for strength, the quiet spaces where human truth surfaced in pure, unfiltered ways. One such moment arrived unexpectedly during a visit to a community center where Michelle had agreed to speak to a group of school children gathered in a sunlit library, smelling faintly of pencil shavings and old books. The children, fidgety and full of restless energy, peppered her with innocent but hilariously blunt questions, like why politicians talk so much but never answer questions, or whether Michelle really had Secret Service agents follow her into the bathroom. Laughing, Michelle glanced out at the sea of bright eyes and mischievous grins and said, "Children are our best truth-tellers and our toughest critics." The room erupted in giggles, especially when one little girl raised her hand and blurted out, "My mom says politicians lie as much as my brother says he didn't eat the cookies." But just as laughter rippled through the room, another small hand slowly rose from the back. A boy, no more than 10, with wide brown eyes and hair that fell into his face, shuffled forward, clutching a crumpled piece of paper in both hands. Without a word, he held it out to Michelle, who took it gently and unfolded it. Drawn in childish strokes of red, white, and blue, the picture showed an American flag and a stick figure of a man in a military uniform, his tiny hand raised in a salute. Below the drawing were scrawled words in large, uneven letters. They said my dad died for freedom, but they lied to him. A hush fell over the room, so sudden and absolute it seemed as though the walls themselves were listening. Michelle felt her throat tighten as she looked into the boy's solemn eyes, realizing that no scandal, no politics, no headlines could possibly encapsulate the depth of that quiet heartbreak. The boy's mother stepped forward, eyes glistening, and whispered, "We waited for help that never came. Now we know why." The laughter from earlier felt impossibly distant as Michelle knelt to the boy's level, gently placing her hand on his shoulder. She wanted to tell him something wise, something that would heal the ache radiating from those few simple words. But all she could manage was a quiet promise. "I see you, and I won't forget." And in that moment, amid the bright walls of the community library, the entire weight of her fight crystallized into a single truth. This wasn't just about politics or revenge. It was about protecting the innocent faith of children who believed their parents died for a country that cared enough to keep its promises. As the tide of revelations swept across Washington and the nation, Michelle found herself both lauded and targeted, her days filled with speaking engagements, private conversations with lawmakers, and endless calls from journalists craving the next chapter of the saga. Yet, through it all, she carried an unexpected calm, buoyed by a truth that could no longer be silenced. During a televised interview on a major network, the host, trying to keep things light before diving into heavy questions, asked if she'd ever regret speaking out so publicly, considering the chaos it had unleashed. Michelle leaned back in her chair, flashed that wry, knowing smile that had become so familiar to millions, and quipped, "I used to think silence was classy. Turns out, speaking up is even classier." The audience burst into laughter, the sound rolling like gentle waves across the studio, a moment of levity in a storm that had shaken even the highest corridors of power. But behind the scenes, shadows still lurked. Late one night, while reviewing documents in a quiet office, lit only by the soft glow of a desk lamp, Michelle's phone rang, displaying an unknown number. She answered, and a male voice, smooth yet edged with unmistakable menace, slid through the receiver. "Mrs. Obama," the voice said, each syllable crisp and cold, "you have no idea what you're stirring up. There are people in this town who will do whatever it takes to bury this. For your sake, I suggest you drop it." There was a pause, just long enough for Michelle to hear her own heartbeat, before she responded, voice calm and resolute. "I think I do," she said, "and so does America." The line went dead, leaving only the echo of silence and the weight of a choice already made. In the days that followed, congressional hearings exploded with testimony. Carla Moore, standing amid a barrage of cameras and microphones, raised her voice in a speech that would play on every news loop for weeks. "If these allegations are true," she declared, fists clenched around her notes, "they shame every public servant who ever swore an oath to serve the American people." Her voice quavered, but her resolve was unshakable. This isn't about parties. It's about truth. And it's about the people who have suffered in silence because powerful figures thought they could play with signatures and lives like pawns on a chessboard. And finally, on a crisp morning, under a sky scrubbed clean by rain, Michelle stood once more before a crowd gathered on the Capitol steps. Her breath puffed in the cool air as she looked out at faces filled with hope and weariness alike. "This story isn't just about me," Michelle said, her voice echoing across the stone columns. "It's about every person who kept silent out of fear, and the moment they decide not to anymore. It's about the veteran's widow who deserves answers, the child who draws flags beside his father's memory, and every American who still believes the truth should matter." She paused, a gentle smile breaking through the lines of exhaustion. "We've all been told to keep quiet, to endure, to wait for the right moment. But the right moment is now. And if I have learned anything, it's that silence may protect the powerful, but truth protects us all. As the crowd erupted in applause, Michelle felt something shift deep in her chest. A release, a quiet certainty that the worst battles were behind her, even if the road ahead remained long. She knew the fight for justice would continue, and that the scars left by secrets would not heal overnight. But in the faces around her, grieving, resolute, unafraid, she saw the seeds of something unbreakable. And as sunlight spilled over the marble steps, Michelle whispered to herself the simple truth that had carried her through every storm. Speaking up is worth it. And with that, the story closed, not on bitterness, but on the powerful promise that no lie, however well hidden, could outlast the courage of a voice finally deciding to be heard. The characters Michelle Obama and Jill Biden portrayed in this story are fictionalized and do not represent real people or real-life events. This narrative is purely a work of creative storytelling and is not intended to depict actual facts or statements by any individual. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my channel so I can keep creating more powerful and inspiring stories for you. Your support means the world, and together we can keep shining a light on truth, justice, and the human spirit.